Rose Petals, Chapter 10. Yakuto waited until Hiroaki had finished reading before he entered the library. He usually didn't care if anyone was there. This time he needed to focus. It had been a little over a month since the group came back from overseas. He had plenty of rest and was eager to get back into his daily routine. Music was his life, his career, his love, but he also had a side hustle that would take him down the back alleys and into the darkness of the night. Along with Ren, he had traveled to Kabuki-cho to see Mr. Koyanagi, a well-respected and feared businessman. He had worked for him before, organizing illegal fights, and even was in the ring a few times. It was a debt long due. As much as Yakuto wanted to leave this type of lifestyle behind, he was forcefully dragged back into it, until the debt was fully paid. When Mr. Koyanagi had a price on your head, it was better you pay for it by any means deemed necessary, or start losing body parts. The debt was not accumulated by Yakuto, but by his dad, who had a severe gambling sickness. He wasn't allowed to gamble in the South District, so he took up illegal gambling houses in the North District. The shogun of this area was one everyone knew not to anger. He had called one of his top businessmen to deal with the situation. No shogun ever got their own hands dirty. He was beaten up real badly when he could not pay what he owed. And so Yakuto went to straighten it out, the best way he knew how. With a baseball bat in arms, he marched down to the warehouse, threatening to destroy everything and break every window in sight. Little did he know that it was the infamous Mr. Koyanagi that he had to settle this debt with, and it was the shogun of the North gambling house the money was owed to. Everything they owned was seized, including their title as an elite, until the debt was paid. A debt that was well in the millions. One fateful day, after school, Yakuto, Ikimori, Tazaki, and Ren found a gang of thugs beating his dad. Blood ran down the sidewalk and onto the streets, as their bikes stopped in front of his house. One of them held a knife to the poor man's throat, while the others kicked and spat on him, demanding that he give them what he owed. The three were able to fight off the gang, and ordered that they be taken to their leader. The main thug gave them the address as he gathered his remaining villains into the van. It was no surprise to Ren that no one came to the poor man's rescue. The neighborhood knew of Mr. Iori's habits and had made every attempt, pleading with him for the sake of his family to stop. It went in one ear and out the other, or it was his own personal demon. They thought a personal beating would add some sense to him, even crippling him in some way. A broken wrist would put him in check, so they thought. Mr. Koyanagi admired the way Yakuto was able to handle his whole gang, barely receiving any bruises. Of course there were Ren, Tazaki, and Ikimori, who held their own. They were still outnumbered 16-4. High school kids against grown men. Yakuto insisted that he work off the debts owed to Mr. Koyanagi, but how much can a high schooler make working at his friend's tea shop? This was before the luxury of being an idol. The only agreement that could be met was to fight it off, which brought in tons of revenues. He agreed and has been a slave to this underground world ever since. He would get into the ring with the roughest, the toughest, and most of the time, the ugliest from around the world. Can you imagine a fighter with a model's face? The poor sap would be beaten into a coma by his ugly counterparts. Out of pure jealousy. Instead, he was placed in the ring with guys whose names were Bad Face Bruno, Dog Mouth Dan, or Pretty Boy Pierre. Not for his pretty looks, but the sassy dancing he did around the ring. It was a dirty and very dangerous business. Ren, Ikimori, Tazaki, and Yakuto had started their high school rock band, in hopes that some of the money they accumulated would be able to pay back the debt. Their rock band was well known amongst the locals, but that wasn't enough. Plus tragedy had forced its way in, altering their course forever. After Tazaki had moved away to another district, Ren had decided the best route was a record label. Playing in bars wasn't giving them the funds they desperately needed. In exchange, they had transformed into pop idols, with few new members and a new look. Their first album had sold well enough to pay back all that Mr. Shima had put into the group. There was money left to work and promote the next project and a few chump change to spend on whatever, which the stress of being an idol made them do so. Mr. Shima held tight to every cent they earned, as if he was entitled to. Until then, he would remain Mr. Koyanagi Ace, or punching bag, whichever way you look at it. He would be under Mr. Koyanagi commands until the debt was paid in full. As for Yakuto's dad, he was grief-stricken that he gauged both of his eyes out. He would never see the face of his wife and children again. This was a secret that was known to Ren and Ikimori and would not be shared with any of the other members. Not that they would squeal on Yakuto, but it would be too stressful for them to bear. Even after Ikimori had moved away, Ren continued with him to every fight, being both his manager, trainer, and cheering squad. Yakuto had prepared himself mind and body to step into the ring again. Mr. Koyanagi's main fighter had taken ill and he needed a replacement. The truth was that he had placed a huge bet on this fight against an up-and-coming Russian fighter. He knew with Yakuto his chance of winning was greater, and if it came down to anything else, it would be a tie. Ren of course discerned it was all a lie, and that Mr. Koyanagi would reap in a lot of revenues on the event alone. But what could he say to his childhood friend, who had made a deal with the devil to save his father? The debt was owed and Yakuto had to pay it. He was the eldest and this was his only choice. Regardless of the outcome, he would stand by his side to the end and remain in his corner to see him through it all. After the hotel staff and everyone was locked in their rooms for a good night's sleep, they made their way towards the subway station. Ren was tired from nights of rewrites, but he would never allow Yakuto to go on his own. Lately, he's been dealing with his own problems, accompanied by chronic migraines, that made his nights sleepless. Tonight would not be about him, it was all about Yakuto. He must hang in there for him, with headaches and tiredness. They got off at the red light district, walked through a few dark alleys, before they reached the door of the underground club. Yakuto gave a password to the security and was quickly ushered in. He was greeted by a few gang members, who were familiar with his and Ren's faces. They took them to Mr. Koyanagi. He was seated close to the ring, where he could see every blow. They were then introduced to the Russian, his coach, manager and last, his stern-faced wife, before heading to the locker room. The Russian was surprised that his opponent was so young and his wife was even more surprised of how attractive Yakuto and his coach were. She cautioned her husband not to ruin his face. This was sure to be an easy win for him. Ren sat down on the locker's bench as Yakuto changed and began to put on the dressing for his hands. Ren held his head, feeling a pain shoot through his nerves. Yakuto looked at him. "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm adjusting, still getting used to the time change." Yakuto shook his head in agreement, and proceeded to swing at the air. "What did you think about the Russian?" "He's pretty tall. I heard he's good with his feet." "Stay clear of it." Ren pulled out his notes from his backpack. He felt another pain. Drawing the notes nearer to his eyes, he focused intensely at the blurred words. After he punches with his right arm, he follows up with a roundhouse kick. Try to grab his feet and throw him off balance. Yakuto nodded again. There were no rules in this type of fight, except for no biting. Anything else was allowed. If I could get a good hit to his ribcage, I know he'll go down fast. Yeah, if you can catch him. You know they call him the Russian roulette. Don't care, I just want to take him down quickly. The announcer called for all fighting parties to come to the ring. Yakuto and Rin said a quick prayer and left the locker room. He put on his headpiece, mouthguard, and entered the ring. Both fighters bowed for good sportsmanship and began to do their last-minute stretches. The first bell rang as a bikini-wearing figure paraded herself around the ring. Mr. Koyanagi winked at her as she stepped out of the ring. She was a looker. He was happy with himself for finding her at the last minute. He'd be even happier once the fight was over. Whichever way it went, he still made money on attendance alone. Charging almost $300 for faraway balcony seats, where the ring and the fighters looked like scribbles, was a sheer rip-off. But this underground fight was well anticipated. Now the first round was on. Rin stood near the ring yelling, screaming as loud as he could. Watch the knees, move, jab, jab, come on, stay focused, get him, good, good, jab. The bell rang again as Yakuto staggered towards him. His ribs were in great pain from a knee encounter by the Russian. Mr. Koyanagi left the comfort of his seat and sat on the edge of the ring. He held onto the ropes as if he was about to mount himself in and pick up where Yakuto left off. He leaned over Yakuto. Come on, champ, stop playing with him and bring him down. Rin handed him a towel and some water. He took another and placed it on the bruised rib. Yakuto lowered his head and closed his eyes. God, I need strength. I feel out of breath. Pops, Ma, I'm so tired. He wiped a tear from his eye and the sweat from his brow. The bell rang again and he was back on his feet. The Russian came around with a kick, connecting again to Yakuto's ribs. He was hit so hard that he flew back into Ren. The referee rushed to his side as he laid partly on the ring's floor and the ropes. Ren held his head back and poured water over him. Can you go on? The referee asked. We can stop the fight right now. Yakuto sat up. He heaved as he tried to control his breathing. No. I'm good. How many fingers am I holding up? He shoved his fingers into Yakuto's face. 4. Correct. He was content with the answer and waited for the Russian's opponent to get back up. Ren helped him to his feet, rubbed his shoulder, and began his cheer. Come on, champ, you got this.
He felt a surge of energy as he shook himself. He was back in the ring. He began to dance as if he was Bruce Lee, making weird cat noises, taunting the Russian giant. As his fierce opponent came closer, he saw an opening and landed a hard blow to the lower part of the giant's ribcage. The Russian fell as the wind was completely knocked out of him. He was able to get up on his knees. His body began shaking when Yakuto landed a swift kick to his face. His bloody mouthguard went flying across the ring as he fell forward. Rin yelled in the back, "Stay down! Stay down!" The referee stood over the fallen fighter. He began to count 1, 2, 3. It was hopeless to go on, for the man barely moved. His breathing was almost faint as paramedics quickly laid him out on a stretcher. Ren was still yelling for the guy to stay down. It was more of a plea, for he knew that his best friend couldn't take another hit. It was known that even after being placed on a stretcher, or almost in an ambulance, a fighter would get up, stagger back into the ring and turn the match around. That was sheer determination, which most have since they were under some kind of mafia or underground control. And in a fight like this anything goes, including last-minute decisions. The referee counted 7-8. The crowd began screaming as the defeated fighter was led out of the building. They waited till the sound of the ambulance was distant, before announcing the winner. They were happy that it was their own native countryman who had won, and not one of them bragging foreigners. He walked over to Yakuto, and held his hands high in the air. The screams got louder. Ren entered the ring, rushed to him, and gave him a hug. Yakuto cried out in pain, holding his ribs. Mr. Koyanagi and the other gang members hoisted him up in the air, cheering louder than the crowd.
Ren and Yakuto sat in the locker room once again. Mr. Koyanagi had sent his personal doctor to bandage and attend to Yakuto's ribs. After that he sent in a massage therapist and an acupuncturist to relieve as much pain as possible. Ren's headaches were gone, and even though Yakuto was still in some form of pain, it was not as strong as before. He was given medication to numb any feeling. The Russian was his toughest opponent. He wasn't sure how much longer he would be able to put up with this way of living. Ren's fear was that his best friend would be crippled or dead if he continued. A fighter was knocked into a coma once and never woke up again. There had to be a way to put an end to this. He thought of throwing Yakuto's father to the sharks. After all, it was his gambling that got them into this in the first place. He knew Yakuto wouldn't have it. He was doing this for his mother and siblings, as well as his father. He didn't want his mother to be a widow and his siblings fatherless, even if he was a good-for-nothing gambler. He could probably ask Mr. Shima for an advance, but he hated the sight of that man. He would not give in so easily, and would want something in return. You couldn't ask for anything without the Shimas wanting something back. They were worse than loan sharks. Heck, they would eat one of their own if it was convenient. He could try the Tanos. They were hard to get a hold of, and many weren't sure where they actually resided. If any society was secret, it would surely be theirs. They only showed up if it had anything to do with the empire, otherwise they were incognito. The Shogun of the North was not a possibility. It was his gambling house that millions was owed. He felt he had no choice. He couldn't lose his best friend. Not too soon and in this way. They had promised each other they would grow old together. Two toothless old men, still spazzing out on their guitars, even if it was an air one. He would ask, even if it meant that he would hate himself for it.